Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. He's making me laugh across the studio screen here. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm exceptionally well. We always have a bit of a giggle before we go live. It's great to be here. You've joined us on the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This is a special edition. We're in an academic break as this goes out live. And what we like to do during an academic break is move away from our traditional format and bring in a special interest item, and I think you're going to love what you're going to hear today. Rory took his time to meet up with the NCS CEO, that's the National Counselling Society CEO, to speak about what I think is a fascinating topic. Give us an insight, Rory.
Well, there's a big debate going on within the therapeutic world about autonomy-centred and process-centred practice. And to break that down, it means a more medical model of how we see mental health and counselling fitting into that, or a more organic, holistic approach, which would be a autonomy-centred approach. And Meg has penned quite an interesting post, I think, which is on the National Counselling Society website regarding this kind of debate that's going on with our profession, and she outlined what autonomy-centred practice was, and she also touched on some of the dangers maybe of over-regulation of the profession. It's a fascinating insight.
Without any further ado, let's dive straight into that content.
And we welcome Meg Moss, Chief Executive Officer for the National Counselling Society. Welcome, Meg. This is the second podcast in a very short space of time, but it's really good to have you back on the podcast again.
Yeah, I know. Thank you, Rory, for having me. It's feeling very familiar now. I'm loving it, and yeah, thanks for having me on to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, you're absolutely welcome, Meg. And we're talking about what I consider a fascinating subject: autonomy-centred versus person-centred practice, or process-centred practice. Let me just rephrase that again. Mm-hmm. Autonomy-centred versus process-centred practice. There is a debate that is being carried out within the world of counselling and psychotherapy about the direction that we go in terms of maybe regulation or hierarchies in terms of where therapists sit. So what is autonomy-centred / process-centred practice?
Yeah, so this was a set of terms that we kind of came up with when we were doing our consultation response to the PSA strategic review. And if you haven't heard about it, the public consultation, maybe not public consultation, but the accredited registers consultation, the profession consultation, is over now. I think that closed on the 18th of February. But there's some really interesting stuff out there about it. So if you haven't heard about it, I'd have a look. But basically, we looked at, we kind of tried to take a step back and look at what's happening in the profession. And we came up with these two ideas about what is happening. So on the one hand, you've got autonomy-centred practice. So that's, so it's an approach which is kind of focused on things like a subjective approach, see the client as a whole person, looks at the client relationship, autonomy, not just for the client, but for the counsellor as well. It's more of maybe a holistic view rather than a focus on symptoms. There's a lot of creativity in there. Obviously, when you're autonomous, you're given the opportunity to be creative. Individualistic approach to evidence. So what works for him may not work for someone else. So it's not measurable in a way that would be amenable to government. What else have we got in there? Kind of flexible. We're not talking about cure or a diagnosis. It's about like a space for well-being, rather than looking at a specific thing that you're trying to stop happening. There's a lot to autonomy-centred practice. Very kind of equality and diversity-centred, which is, a big thing that is really important to counsellors. And it looks at the whole thing, so it's not just mental health, but it's also looking at the impact of society and how that impacts on our well-being. So and that's kind of almost in contrast to what we're seeing as process-centred practice, which is things like so where you have a diagnosis, what the client's problem is, and you have a treatment plan, and then you have this kind of box-ticking empirical approach to kind of what the evidence is. And there is a set way of dealing with that problem, and it doesn't necessarily matter if it's right for that particular person. This problem has a solution, and this is the solution. These kind of things. So process-centred practice is stuff that's more measurable. It integrates more with the medical model than autonomy-centred practice, which at the moment, how we see the medical model, it doesn't really integrate at all. And rather than, so it's more of a profession than a vocation. So for us, counselling fields, it's very much a vocation. That's something that we've been talking about for a really long time. But maybe process-centred practice is more a profession. It talks about cures and all of that, and treatment plans and that sort of thing. So that's kind of where we see the difference between those two things.
I think it's really interesting. I'm hearing this, and I'm tempted to say that it almost feels like the same kind of dialogue that happened in the 1950s that Carl Rogers had with the profession at the time, where the dominant form was diagnosis, was a very quantitative approach. In other words, very measurement and goal driven. And Rogers came in and said, well, actually, human beings don't roll like that. They're very individual. They're very diverse. It's what the client wants. It's more a qualitative, in other words, a lived experience of the client, and we fit around the client. And when I always think of the medical model, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I always think of the medical model as prescriptive, i.e., this happens, therefore we treat it in this way. Whereas I've always been brought up in therapy to think of, we listen to what the client wants and try and accommodate the client's needs.
Yeah, it's a very person-centred approach, isn't it? Autonomy-centred practice. A lot of it centres around person-centred, but actually there are lots of different practices that are not necessarily person-centred that are still autonomous. And I think that I'm sure I was going with that thought now. But yes, but there is a pull between that kind of Rogerian style of thinking versus a kind of more, I don't know if it's an analytical side of things. I don't know where the pull is in the other direction for me, because that's not my area of expertise. But for me, it comes down to things like being able to kind of prove to government that what it is that you're doing is working, and the money that they're giving you is going in the right direction. I was having a conversation with someone on Facebook this morning about it on I can't remember which page it was. I think it was the CT UK page, about how when you're in a big organisation, so something like the NHS, for example, you lose a sense of who your staff are. So for me, I work in a small organisation. I know every single one of my staff members, from me as the CEO down to everybody in membership services. I know them all really well. I know what they do. I know how they work. When you get to this kind of behemoth like the NHS, you've got, you don't know who your staff are. So then you need to get down into things like KPIs and number crunching, and you use that to say if the service that you're providing is any good, rather than knowing if your team are cohesive and if they're working well together, if they're motivated, if their morale is high, if they're happy. And I think that's part of one of the reasons that we we have this kind of, especially from an NHS perspective, and I'm wondering if that's seeping out into the rest of the profession somehow. Is this, we need to be able to measure it. We need to know where you started, where you finished, what's your score now.
Yeah, so it's I think what I'm hearing you say is that you lose the individual aspect both of the person who's delivering the therapy, the therapist, and the client. It gets lost in the statistics, and governments are very keen on statistical models. We've heard a lot about statistical models through the coronavirus epidemic. They're very keen on statistics because they say, well, the statistics drives the evidence, and the evidence drives the funding. And counselling is never really, I don't think, fitted in to a medical model because it's about diagnosing. It's about helping the client make sense of their lived experience, and it is a contrary to a medical way of working. A medic would say, "What's wrong with you?" They make a diagnosis and they prescribe.
Yeah, exactly. I can see the statistics, the importance of data and statistics in so many other fields, but not in this particular field. And this is where really making the case for autonomy-centred practice as opposed to process-centred practice is really important. Because I think by doing that, you see how much of a benefit you get from highlighting that autonomous nature of that practice, and how much of a difference that makes to both the practitioner and then subsequently to the client. We're not accountants, we don't work in finite numbers of things or definite absolutes. We work in this whole range and spectrum of human well-being and experience, which is, by its own nature, chaotic and messy and wonderful and vibrant. And you can't put it in a box. And we just need to be able to be ourselves in that therapy room. And I think that's really hard to do when you have a list of things you have to do in order to fix the person that is in front of you. And so that's that for me is why it's important for us to really start having this conversation a lot more in terms of, this process-centered practice isn't really what we are about as a profession. We're autonomous at heart. This is where we are. This is where we should be aiming for.
Yes, and I think one of the things that sometimes comes up when we're talking about autonomy-centered practice, about meeting our, as I used to say when I taught, meeting our clients where they're at, is what impact might the profession, if the profession was regulated? Lots of voices saying counselling psychotherapy should be regulated, and I think there's some second-order consequences to regulation, and I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, for sure. And regulation ties in here really interestingly, because when you talk about regulation, you are potentially talking about increasing things like standardization. So you potentially end up with this kind of homogenous practice, because how would you regulate something where there's no consistency, where there's no one particular way of practicing? And so then by bringing in regulation, by bringing in standardization in a really strict way, you end up having this, you limit the scope of practice for the practitioners, and they don't end up doing as, in the same way. So, and then the other upshot of that is that you would potentially have, and this is something that we looked at in our a response to the PSA strategic review. You would have people leaving the profession because suddenly it's become something they no longer enjoy. It's too cumbersome to keep up whatever they need to do for, say, it was something like HCPC regulation. It's an additional cost, so that there may be higher costs involved. At the moment, we have a variety of organisations, all of whom charge different amounts for their accredited register. In regulation, you may not have that opportunity to have slightly more accessible organisations in terms of cost. And then, so you also may have people simply changing title, changing what they call themselves to avoid regulation, which again kind of negates the whole point of regulation in the end, doesn't it? I think we were talking about this, you and I, the other day. People don't necessarily go to a counsellor because of their title. In some ways, there's a lot of word of mouth. There's a lot of how you market yourself in your Facebook page in your hometown, and all of that sort of thing. You get referrals from other colleagues, from clients, previous clients. They might make referrals to you. It's not necessarily your title or your qualifications or your registration status that people really look at.
Absolutely, I totally agree, and certainly, speaking as a private practitioner, I cannot think of anybody. One I can think of now. I'm thinking deeply. One person who wanted to see my qualifications, and I used to make a point when I'm contracted with a client of having my folder of qualifications, and they really aren't interested, nor are they interested, with the greatest respect to the ethical body that I'm under. They're not bothered at all. They're hurting. They need to be heard. They need just that sanctuary of the therapy room. I often say to my clients, please have a look at my webpage or my Facebook page if you want to see my qualifications. I would imagine that hardly anybody ever does. And I think there's a danger of it being a vertical profession where it's seen as hierarchical, as opposed to a horizontal profession where we expand our scope of practices. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
At the moment, it's feeling quite hierarchical. Yeah, I don't know. So for me, what I personally see a lot of in practice is, as in the people actually doing the work in the profession, is a lot of adding things to your toolkit. We see a lot of people doing a huge variety of CPD and gaining their knowledge, doing things like researching and writing articles to make themselves more knowledgeable on a particular subject. See a lot of people very passionate about learning more and growing in that way. And a lot of our members have been in the profession for a really long time. We've got people who've been in the profession for 10, 15, 20 years, and that longevity is important as well. And I think, we are seeing a push towards hierarchy. I think, especially in terms of this, the counsellor versus psychotherapist debate, which for the NCS, obviously, we land on, counselling is psychotherapy. There's no real difference from our perspective. So there is that, and it's disheartening, because I don't feel like it's a profession that particularly should have a hierarchy in it.
So I guess the question I want to ask is, does that mean the NCS is anti-regulation? Are you opposed as an organisation to regulation?
So we're happy to support a system of regulation. So as in something that increases public assurance or encourages public assurance, but we're really, really wary of basically over-regulating. So to the point where people would leave the profession, like I said. So the upshot of that then being that services like the NHS, for example, have to take that additional strain somehow because there are fewer people working to support the well-being of society. Or they would practice outside of the realm of counselling and psychotherapy, which is something that we talked about in our PSA consultation review. So I think for us, basically the current accredited registers programme is pretty much spot on. And I think that any kind of, I know there's a massive pull in politics from some areas to regulate, to protect title. And I think protecting titles would appease a lot of that, a lot of those calls. People talk a lot about kind of rogue counsellors, people who have done no training or one of those £29 become a counsellor courses that you see every now and again. And I do get it. And I think protection of title somehow, if it can be done very, very gently and delicately without restricting practice, because you have this amazing diversity in counselling in terms of how every individual practices, and it would be gutting to lose that through over-regulating. So personally, and on behalf of the NCS as well, our position is that anything really much more, I think we've hit the sweet spot in terms of regulation with the accredited registers programme.
Yes, and just to clarify, I've heard you talk about the PSA and the HCPC. Maybe just outline what those are, because I think those could be confusing terms. So the PSA, help us with that. What are they first of all, and what are the differences?
So the Professional Standards Authority were set up by the Department of Health in 2012. No, they weren't set up in 2012. The Accredited Registers Programme was set up by them in 2012. The PSA are a part of the Department of Health, and they oversee regulators. So they oversee things like the General Medical Council, for example, and they also oversee the Accredited Registers Programme. So us, the BACP, UKCP, and then other professions, so sports rehabilitation, things like cosmetic surgery type things. There's such a wide variety of professions that come under that. Acupuncture is another one. I always struggle to think of the other professions under there. So they basically check all of the work that we do as an accredited register holder. Every year we have to submit our documentation for reaccreditation. And it's quite a thorough process that we go through every year. So that's kind of who they are. They're our regulator, basically. And they make sure that we're doing a really good job and that our standards are not just high, but improving. So they push you to improve every year. They're really, really helpful, really knowledgeable, obviously with the work that they do for like the General Medical Council and all of the other statutory registers. And then so the HCPC is the Healthcare Professions Council, who regulate some of the professions in the UK, obviously healthcare professions. And there was a conversation back way before my time in 2009, where they were looking to regulate counselling and psychotherapy through the Healthcare Professions Council. And there was a huge backlash from the profession about that. And under the current government, it's really not a priority to bring that back up again, which is, from my perspective and the perspective of a lot of people that I talk to in the profession, really great. So that's the difference. So yeah, HCPC are a statutory regulator. They oversee, the PSA oversee HCPC, they oversee us. But that's the difference between statutory, which is HCPC, and us as
Yes. So
optional.
a good way of summing that up, I think, would be that anybody with a protected title would usually be under the HCPC, and those of us who haven't got protected titles would be under the
Like accredited registers
accredited registers
program. Yeah.
and just so our listeners can get a sense of that, the Professional Standards Authority work with ethical bodies like the NCS, and what happens is practitioners who are qualified and fit the criteria get a PIN number. I've got a PIN number, and I renew that PIN number every year through my professional body, and that is the voluntary aspect of the register. So I'm actually on the register, and if a complaint's made against me, presumably if it's upheld, I could be struck off, which means technically I wouldn't be able to join a ethical body. So that's the difference, and I think it's really important to get that across, that people say that counselling isn't regulated. It isn't statutory regulated by law. But there is a robust regulation in there and an accountability.
There's a voluntary regulation system, which I think works really well. And the opportunity to make that statutory, but also underpinned by the diversity of the programme as it is. So by the accredited registers program, so the opportunity to make that program compulsory rather than voluntary, especially for the profession of counselling and psychotherapy, would be potentially that kind of ideal balance there, that kind of meets everyone's requirements. And people who really, really don't want statutory regulation because it would potentially totally diminish their practice, versus the people who really, really do want some kind of safety in terms of statutory regulation in place, because it protects their title, which therefore arguably protects members of the public from people who would potentially do some kind of harm through that. It's not a perfect system, because we still see, even in statutory regulated environments, there are still issues, there is still harm, but it does just mean that people can't practice unless they've done the right kind of qualifications. So it's kind of a harm reduction thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the things that I really want to ask is, how do you come to these conclusions? I presume that the NCS hasn't just kind of sat around and thought this would be a good idea. Everything you do seems to be everything you do seems to be based in some form of research. So what is the research base that you've used to kind of come up with with the NCS's ideas here?
Yeah, so as an organisation, we obviously we're quite member-led. That is the heart of what we do, very member-led in all things. So over the years, we've done a lot of communicating with our members, researching with our members, asking them, what should we do about this? If this happens, what would you like us to do? And a lot of it's come off the back of that. So in writing this response, the response that we wrote to the PSA as part of their strategic review, looking at how they might change regulation for the accredited registers, we looked back at all of the research that we've done over the years. We've considered a lot of the arguments and debates around things like the HCPC regulation, things that other people have published on the matter, things that have kind of prevalent debates in the profession over the past kind of couple of decades. And yeah, I think most of it's from members. We did another big piece of research for this Professional Standards Authority review, and asked our members what they would do in certain circumstances. And we've kind of based our thoughts on that. And a lot of it is just to make sure that, if we are limiting people's scope of practice, then you have to know that there'll be a massive knock-on effect for the whole profession and for society as a whole. If you see people leaving the profession because they no longer wish to comply with, increasingly strict regulation, then because it's not easy being a counsellor, it's a really tough job and not massively well paid. And I imagine if you push people to it, they would get to a point where they think, actually, on balance, I'm going to go and do something else.
Yes.
So I think it's really important for people to know that if you restrict practice too much, if you take that autonomy away, the thing that people really love about their profession is just going to go, and you're going to lose. You'll lose people. The strain on the NHS will increase because all these people are really helping, like they're making a huge difference. And if they suddenly decide that their profession is not taking care of them well enough, and they can no longer, put in that emotional energy if they're not being supported enough the other side, which I would totally understand. It's just going to be a huge knock-on effect, and we'll see an even bigger mental health crisis than the one that we've got at the moment.
There isn't, many would say there isn't enough counsellors or access to counselling as it is, and a reduction in either those colleagues leaving the profession because they didn't want the burden of added regulation, and those colleagues who are yet, I say to use the word colleagues, those students who are thinking about training may very well decide it's not a profession they want to enter. So you have a two-headed idea here. You've got people leaving and people not entering, and the actual pool of therapists starts to decline.
Yeah, exactly. It's when you go to become a counsellor, you do it because you have passion for helping others. You do it because you want to make a difference. You do it because not because you want to make big bucks or anything. You go into it. You hope it'd be better paid than it is for a lot of people, for sure. And that's a different conversation that we're all hoping to work on and change as well. But you go into it because you love it. It's about love. It's about caring. It's about passion. It's about creativity. And I think we really risk, if what we do strips that away, people aren't going to be enticed into it. You're right. Students aren't going to go into it if your path to that is reduces that creativity. If it's too clinical, if it's too strict, you might find that people start and then they get halfway through and they think, this is not what I expected. So yeah, for sure. I think it's a huge question and a huge potential problem for the profession if it's not really keenly thought about.
Well, Meg, thank you for joining us today. I think you've outlined beautifully why autonomy-centred practice is something that we should cherish, hold on to, even fight for. I use the term advisedly 100%. And thoughtfully. And as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very, very much to Meg from the National Counselling Society, the NCS. Thank you to you, Rory, for taking your time to get together with Meg to go over that very, very interesting topic. And of course, if you want to get more information, all you need to do is go to counsellingtutor.com, click on our podcast tab and look for a recent podcast, NCS Special Edition, all of the links to more information on this and to the NCS website can be found within that page there.
Yes, and again, we thank Meg. And as always, stay grounded, stay safe, and hey, join the digital counselling revolution.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counsellor CPD Library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counsellor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counsellor CPD library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.